The moment Mrs. Eleanor Grace looked up at Steve Harvey and asked, "Where am I?" in front of 300 people, everyone in the Family Feud studio knew they were witnessing something more profound than television. Steve Harvey had been hosting game shows long enough to handle almost anything. Contestants who fainted from excitement, families who argued on stage, answers so outrageous they left him speechless. But when a 78-year-old former teacher with gentle eyes and trembling hands stood at his podium and forgot where she was, Steve faced something he'd never encountered before. Mrs. Eleanor Grace had been teaching for 43 years when Alzheimer's disease began stealing her memories, one precious moment at a time. For 4 decades, she had shaped young minds in Cleveland's inner-city schools, turning struggling students into scholars, teaching children not just mathematics and reading, but dignity, perseverance, and the belief that their dreams mattered regardless of their circumstances. Her granddaughter Sarah, 24 and fresh out of college, had brought her to Family Feud as what she privately feared might be their last adventure together. Every week, Mrs. Grace remembered a little less. Names of former students began slipping away. The stories she'd told 1,000 times started fragmenting. But there were still moments, brilliant flashes, when the woman who had dedicated her life to education shone through the growing fog of her disease. The Grace family had made it through the audition process 6 months earlier, when Mrs. Grace was having more good days than bad. Sarah, her mother Patricia, her uncle James, and Mrs. Grace herself had charmed the producers with their warmth and obvious love for each other. But in the months between audition and taping, the disease had progressed faster than anyone had expected. That morning, getting ready for the show, Mrs. Grace had asked Sarah 3 times why they were getting dressed up. Each time, Sarah had gently explained about Family Feud, about Steve Harvey, about their chance to win money for the family. Each time, Mrs. Grace had smiled and nodded as if hearing it for the first time, which in many ways she was. The studio lights were brighter than Sarah had expected. Mrs. Grace squinted slightly as they took their positions at the podium, her hand gripping Sarah's arm for stability. She wore her best dress, navy blue with small white flowers, the same one she'd worn to her retirement party 3 years earlier when the entire school district had honored her service. Steve had noticed Mrs. Grace immediately during the family introductions. There was something about the way she carried herself, a dignity that transcended age, that spoke of a lifetime spent in service to others. When he knelt down to talk to her, she was shorter than most contestants at barely 5 feet tall. He saw intelligence in her eyes, even if it flickered like a candle in the wind. "Mrs. Grace," Steve had said with genuine respect, "what did you do before you retired?" "I was a teacher," she had replied clearly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded classrooms for decades. 43 years, mathematics and reading, East Cleveland Elementary. 43 years, Steve had exclaimed, and the audience had burst into appreciative applause. "That's a hero right there, folks. Mrs. Grace, you shaped a lot of young lives." She had smiled then, that radiant smile that had encouraged thousands of students over the years. "Every child can learn," she had said simply. "You just have to find the right way to reach them." The game had started smoothly. The Grace family was competing against the Williams family from Detroit, and the energy was high. Mrs. Grace's family had rallied around her, subtly guiding her when she seemed confused, celebrating enthusiastically when she contributed a good answer. During the second round, when Steve asked for things you might find in a classroom, Mrs. Grace had stepped forward with confidence and said, "Hope." It wasn't on the board, but the audience had erupted in applause anyway, understanding instinctively that they'd just heard something profound. Steve had paused, looking at this tiny woman who had just given an answer that wasn't about points or winning, but about truth. "Mrs. Grace," he had said softly, "that's the best answer we've never had on the board." But it was during the third round that everything changed. The question was, name something that gets better with age. Sarah had just given a solid answer, wine, earning the number 2 spot. The family was celebrating when Steve, following his instincts, decided to ask Mrs. Grace for her thoughts. "Mrs. Grace," Steve said, walking over to her with that easy smile, "what gets better with age?" Mrs. Grace stepped forward to the podium, but something in her expression had shifted. The confident teacher who had spoken about hope just minutes earlier seemed to flicker, like a television losing its signal. She gripped the podium with both hands, looking around the studio with growing confusion. The bright lights, the audience noise, the cameras, everything that had been manageable moments before suddenly seemed overwhelming. Sarah noticed first, reaching out instinctively to steady her grandmother. Patricia and James stepped closer, forming a protective circle around the woman who had always been their rock. Mrs. Grace looked up at Steve, and for a moment, the fog cleared completely. She saw a kind man in an expensive suit, but she couldn't remember why she was supposed to know him or why hundreds of people were staring at her. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice small and frightened in a way that cut through the studio noise like a blade. The audience fell silent, not the polite waiting silence of a game show, but the profound quiet of people witnessing something deeply human and heartbreaking. Steve's smile faded, not from impatience or annoyance but from immediate understanding that this woman wasn't just confused, she was lost. "Mrs. Grace," Steve said gently, setting down his cards and stepping closer to her, "you're exactly where you belong. You're with people who love you." But Mrs. Grace's confusion was deepening. She looked at Sarah, at Patricia, at James, seeing familiar faces, but unable to place them in the context of this strange, bright place. "I think I'm supposed to be somewhere else," she said, her voice trembling. "My students are waiting for me." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. This was what they'd all been dreading, the moment when the disease would take her grandmother away, even while she was still standing right there. "Grandma," Sarah whispered, "it's okay, we're here with you." Steve Harvey had spent 40 years in entertainment, but he'd also spent a lifetime watching his own mother age, had seen the dignity of elderly people who deserved respect even when their minds began to fail them. He looked at Miss Grace, this tiny woman who had dedicated her life to teaching children, who had shaped generations of young minds, and made a decision that transcended television. "Cut," he called to the production booth, but not in the sharp way of someone stopping a show. His voice was gentle, authoritative, the voice of someone taking control to protect rather than perform. "We're taking a moment here." The cameras kept rolling, but the game stopped. Steve walked around the podium and approached Mrs. Grace with the careful respect he would show his own grandmother. He didn't kneel down this time. She was a woman who deserved to be met at eye level, teacher to teacher. "Mrs. Grace," he said, his voice carrying across the silent studio, "my name is Steve Harvey, and you are Mrs. Eleanor Grace, one of the finest teachers Cleveland has ever known." Something in his tone, the formal way he introduced himself, seemed to anchor her. Teachers understood introductions, understood the importance of knowing who you were talking to. She looked at him more carefully, studying his face. "You taught at East Cleveland Elementary for 43 years. Steve continued, his voice steady and clear. "You taught mathematics and reading to hundreds of children. You believed that every child could learn, and you made sure they knew it too." Mrs. Grace's breathing began to slow. The panic in her eyes started to fade as Steve's words gave her something to hold on to, not where she was but who she was. "I don't remember coming here," she said quietly. "That's okay," Steve replied. "You don't have to remember everything, but I want you to remember this. You are surrounded by your family. Sarah, your granddaughter who loves you. Patricia, your daughter who is so proud of you. James, who drove all the way here just to be with you today." He gestured to each family member as he named them, giving Mrs. Grace a roadmap back to the people who mattered most. "And you know what else? You're in a room full of people who respect teachers, who understand that what you did for 43 years was more important than any game show could ever be." The audience began to react, but not with applause. With something deeper, recognition of witnessing a masterclass in human dignity, in how to treat someone whose mind was failing them with the respect their lifetime of service had earned. Steve turned to address the entire studio. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet Mrs. Eleanor Grace. For 43 years she stood in front of classrooms and taught children that they mattered, that they could learn, that they had potential. She probably taught reading to kids who became doctors, math to future engineers, hope to children who had given up on themselves. Mrs. Grace was listening now, her confusion beginning to clear as Steve's words reminded her not of where she was but of who she had always been. Mrs. Grace, Steve said, turning back to her, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer as a teacher, not as a game show contestant. What gets better with age? She looked at him thoughtfully, and for a moment, the brilliant educator who had touched so many lives shone through the fog of her disease. Understanding, she said clearly. The older you get, the more you understand that love is all that really matters. The studio erupted, but this time it wasn't game show applause. It was the sound of 300 people recognizing wisdom when they heard it, acknowledging a woman who, even in her confusion, could still teach them something profound. But Steve wasn't finished. He began to remove his suit jacket, the same navy blue jacket he wore for every taping. Mrs. Grace, he said, I want you to have this, not because you're a contestant, but because you're a teacher, and teachers deserve to know that their work matters, that their students remember them, that their lessons live on long after the final bell rings. He draped the jacket gently around her shoulders. It was far too large for her small frame, but she wore it like the academic robes she'd never had the chance to earn, having spent her career in public schools rather than universities. This jacket has been with me for every show I've hosted, Steve said. It's heard thousands of answers, seen hundreds of families, but today it's being worn by someone who spent her life asking the right questions and helping others find their own answers. Mrs. Grace touched the fabric of the jacket, and something in the gesture, perhaps the weight of it, perhaps the kindness behind it, seemed to ground her completely. She looked at Steve with clear eyes. Thank you, she said simply. You're very kind. Your mother raised you well. The comment, so natural and teacher-like, broke something open in Steve. Here was a woman who, even in the midst of her own confusion, still thought to acknowledge good parenting, still saw her role as someone who recognized and encouraged goodness in others. Mrs. Grace, Steve said, his voice thick with emotion. Can I tell you something? My mama always said the best gift she could give me was respect for my teachers. She said teachers see potential in children that sometimes their own families miss. And you, ma'am, you've been seeing that potential for 43 years. He turned to Sarah, Patricia, and James. Y'all know what you have here? You have a living treasure. This woman didn't just teach mathematics and reading. She taught children how to believe in themselves. That's a gift that keeps giving, generation after generation. Sarah was crying openly now, not from sadness but from gratitude that someone understood the magnitude of what they were losing, day by day, memory by memory. She was the best teacher in the school, Sarah managed to say. Students would request her class specifically. Parents would ask for their children to be placed with Mrs. Grace. I believe it, Steve said. I can see it in her eyes. You can always tell a real teacher. They never stop caring about their students, even when they can't remember their names. Mrs. Grace had been listening to this conversation about her with the slight confusion of someone hearing themselves discussed in the third person. But when Steve turned back to her, she was present again, fully there. Mr. Harvey, she said, and Steve was surprised she remembered his name. Do you have children? Yes, ma'am, I do. Are they good students? Steve smiled, recognizing the teacher's instinct to ask about children's education, to care about their academic progress even in a casual conversation. They try their best, Mrs. Grace. Some subjects come easier than others. That's normal, she said with the authority of someone who had seen every type of learner. Every child has their own pace. The important thing is that they keep trying, and that their parents support their efforts. The conversation was so natural, so thoroughly normal, that for a moment everyone in the studio forgot about the game show, forgot about the cameras, forgot about everything except this exchange between a host and a teacher who was doing what she'd done for 4 decades, caring about children's education. Mrs. Grace, Steve said, would you mind if I asked you for some advice? About being a better parent, about supporting my children's learning. Her face lit up with the kind of joy teachers feel when someone asks them about their expertise. when their knowledge is valued. Of course, she said, the most important thing is to let them know that effort matters more than perfect grades. Praise them for working hard, not just for being smart, and read with them, even when they're old enough to read on their own. Children are never too old to enjoy hearing a story. Steve was nodding, genuinely absorbing her advice, treating her not as a confused, elderly woman, but as the expert educator she had always been. That's wisdom right there, he said. Ladies and gentlemen, you're getting free parenting advice from one of Cleveland's finest teachers. The audience laughed, but it was warm laughter, the kind that recognizes something beautiful happening in front of them. As the moment continued, something remarkable occurred. Mrs. Grace's confusion didn't return. Perhaps it was being treated with respect. Perhaps it was being asked about her life's work. Perhaps it was simply the kindness Steve had shown her. But for the remainder of the taping she was present, engaged, the brilliant educator her family remembered. When the game resumed, she contributed thoughtful answers. When her team won the round, she celebrated with genuine joy. And when Steve asked her one final question, "Mrs. Grace, what's the most important lesson you ever taught?" she answered without hesitation, that every mistake is a chance to learn something new. And that kindness is always the right answer, even when it's not the easy one. The episode aired 3 months later, exactly as it happened, with no editing to remove Steve's decision to stop and honor Mrs. Grace's moment of confusion with dignity, rather than embarrassment. The response was unprecedented. Teachers across the country wrote to thank Steve for showing respect to one of their own. Families dealing with Alzheimer's shared their own stories of dignity preserved in the face of a cruel disease. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Mrs. Grace's former students. Hundreds of them, now adults with children of their own, reached out to share memories of the teacher who had believed in them when they couldn't believe in themselves. They created a scholarship fund in her name, ensuring that her legacy of caring about education would continue long after her memory faded. Mrs. Grace wore Steve's jacket to every important family gathering for the remaining months of clarity she had. At Thanksgiving dinner, at Sarah's wedding, at the birth of her first great-grandchild, the jacket became a symbol not of her disease but of her dignity, of the respect she had earned through a lifetime of service. Steve Harvey kept a photograph from that day on his desk, Mrs. Grace wearing his jacket, smiling with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was, even if she couldn't always remember where she was. He would look at it before difficult interviews, before challenging shows, as a reminder that the most important moments in television happen when you choose humanity over entertainment. 6 months after the taping, Mrs. Grace's condition had progressed to the point where she no longer recognized her family consistently. But Sarah noticed something remarkable, even in her deepest confusion, when she couldn't remember her own name. If someone mentioned teaching or asked her about children's education, she would brighten. The teacher in her remained long after other memories had faded. Steve had given her his personal phone number that day, and though she never called, Sarah did. She would update him on her grandmother's condition, thank him for the respect he had shown, share stories of the small moments when the brilliant educator still shone through. When Mrs. Grace passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 years later, Steve attended the funeral. He spoke briefly about the day he met her, about how she had taught him that true dignity means treating every person as if their life's work matters, regardless of what illness or age might steal from them. The funeral was packed with former students, fellow teachers, and family members whose lives had been touched by a woman who believed that every child could learn and that kindness was always the right answer. Steve's jacket was buried with her, a symbol of the respect she had earned and the grace she had shown, even in her most vulnerable moments. The lesson Mrs. Grace taught that day at Family Feud wasn't about game show answers or winning prizes. It was about dignity, about honoring the contributions people make over a lifetime, about treating confusion with compassion rather than impatience. She reminded everyone watching that behind every elderly person struggling with memory loss is a human being who once had dreams, expertise, and wisdom worth preserving. And Steve Harvey learned that sometimes the most profound teaching happens not in a classroom but in a television studio, when a retired teacher in a borrowed jacket shows the world what grace looks like in the face of a disease that steals everything except the love that surrounds it.